A millionaire is determined to change the life of a poor stranger because he wants to take revenge on his ex-lover. However, after 30 days of betting, he has the Grand Manhattan Hotel. Hotel's grand ballroom was lavishly adorned, bordering on extravagance. Glittering crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, while rare orchids decorated each table with meticulous precision. It was the night of the launch for Vanguard Couture's latest collection, the largest fashion conglomerate in America. Its CEO, Richard Monroe, surveyed the room with a satisfied, almost smug smile. At 40 years old, Richard had built an empire that commanded the respect of even the most seasoned industry veterans. His commanding presence, always impeccably dressed, drew attention wherever he went. The streaks of grey at his temples lent him an air of maturity that contrasted with his still youthful face. His piercing green eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to take in every detail of the surroundings. But that evening, something was off. He checked his platinum watch, a gift from his fiancée, Tiffany Carter, for what felt like the 100th time. She still hadn't arrived. Known for her fashionably late appearances, tonight was different. As the face of Vanguard Couture, Tiffany was expected to be present an hour ago. "Mr. Monroe," a hesitant voice broke his thoughts. It was Melissa, his assistant, with a troubled expression. "You need to see this." She handed him the tablet she was holding, displaying the homepage of the country's leading news portal. The headline instantly chilled him. Tiffany Carter, fiancée of billionaire Richard Monroe, spotted in romantic fling with famous actor in Ibiza. The accompanying photos left no room for doubt. Tiffany, unmistakably relaxed and indulgent, was in the arms of Carlos Vincent, a well-known soap opera star and her apparent lover. The pictures were dated just the day before, while Tiffany had supposedly been in Milan for a photo shoot. Richard experienced a sudden shift in his surroundings. The composure he had mastered through years of managing corporate crises seemed to falter. The chatter around him began to fade, replaced by the murmurs of the growing crowd. "Sir," Melissa tried again to get his attention, "the PR team is asking for a statement." Before he could respond, a louder commotion swept through the room. Tiffany Carter had arrived, stunning in a crimson gown that accentuated her breathtaking beauty. Her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders in perfectly styled waves, and her smile, rehearsed for the cameras, betrayed no hint of guilt or concern. Richard watched, dumbfounded, as she glided toward him as if nothing had happened. The photographers present began snapping furiously, sensing the tension about to erupt. "Darling," Tiffany said loudly, her artificial smile firmly in place. "I'm so sorry for being late. The flight from Milan was delayed." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard could feel every eye in the room fixed on him, anticipating his reaction. His desire to expose her deception clashed with years of emotional restraint and social decorum. "Milan?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled but laced with irony. "Are you sure it wasn't Ibiza?" Tiffany's smile faltered for a split second, but quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about, love," she replied smoothly. "Don't you?" Richard took the tablet from Melissa's hands and held it up for Tiffany to see, displaying the incriminating photos now circulating online. "Perhaps this will jog your memory." For a moment, Tiffany's face went pale, but she quickly replaced it with a defiant expression. Guests nearby watched the scene unfold, torn between discomfort and fascination. Leaning closer to Richard, Tiffany lowered her voice, her tone icy. "If you want to do this here, let's be honest. Do you really think I'd settle for being just another one of your trophies? You may have all the money in the world, Richard, but you have no idea what love is. You never did, and you never will." Richard was taken aback by her words. Before Richard could reply, Tiffany abruptly turned and strode towards the exit, leaving behind not only the man she had once vowed to love, but also a trail of whispers and speculation that within minutes would dominate headlines across the nation. Richard stood frozen, the weight of countless eyes bearing down on him. His personal life, once kept under tight control, had just turned into a public spectacle, and for the first time in a long while, the powerful Richard Monroe had no idea how to respond. A week after the scandal, Richard stood by the windows of his penthouse in Tribeca Heights, staring out at the city of New York. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, mirroring his somber mood. His desk was covered in magazines and newspapers, each splashed with headlines about his public humiliation. "It won't do any good to dwell on this," said Laura, his younger sister and the legal director of Vanguard Couture, as she flipped through contracts Tiffany had signed with the company. "We need to focus on minimizing the damage to the brand." Richard ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare gesture betraying his unease. "It's not just about the brand, Laura. It's about my reputation. That snake made me look like a fool. And you're giving her exactly what she wants by acting like this," Laura replied, adjusting her gold-framed glasses. "Tiffany has always been an opportunist who—" The sound of Richard's phone interrupted her. It was a text message from Tiffany. "Launch party for the new Vogue campaign tonight. I'll be there with Carlos. I trust you won't mind running into us. After all, business is business." Laura noticed the change in her brother's expression. "What now?" "She's going to the Vogue party. With him," Richard muttered, his jaw tightening. "And she has the audacity to say she hopes you don't mind." "Then don't go," Laura suggested pragmatically. "Send someone from the board to represent Vanguard." "And make it look like I'm hiding?" "Never." Richard stood abruptly. "I'll be there, and I'll show her exactly what I'm capable of." Laura recognized that tone. It was the same one he used before closing major deals, when he was about to do something remarkable or potentially disastrous. The event was held at the Modern Art Museum, transformed into a dazzling venue for America's fashion elite. Richard arrived deliberately late, causing the stir he anticipated. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit in a deep blue that complemented his green eyes, paired with a silver silk tie. It didn't take long for him to spot Tiffany, radiant in a gold gown, clinging to Carlos Vincent's arm and laughing at something he said. With a smile reminiscent of a toothpaste commercial, the actor waved to the photographers as if he was the star of the show. "Richard," Tiffany's voice rang out louder than necessary as he walked by. "What a pleasant surprise. I thought you wouldn't show up after, well, you know." Nearby guests paused, sensing another dramatic encounter. Richard turned, a calculated smile on his face. "Missed the chance to see you doing what you do best, Tiffany." "Never." His tone was smooth, but laced with sarcasm. "By the way, Carlos, congratulations. You finally landed the lead role this time." Tiffany's eyes narrowed, catching the double meaning. "You know, Richard," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "maybe this was for the best. You never truly understood what it means to connect with someone. For you, everything is about deals, contracts, and appearances. And for you, it's about how much you can gain from every relationship, isn't it?" Richard shot back, maintaining his diplomatic smile. "You're incapable of being with someone who isn't part of your perfectly controlled world," Tiffany provoked, raising her voice slightly. "I bet you wouldn't last a month married to someone outside our social circle." Something in her emphasis on our social circle ignited a spark of anger in Richard. The bystanders now openly eavesdropped, their curiosity unabashed. "Care to bet?" The words escaped his mouth before he could think. "Not only can I marry someone completely outside our circle, but I can make her a more refined and elegant lady than you'll ever be." Tiffany laughed, a crystalline and mocking sound that drew even more attention. "Oh, really? And how long do you think this transformation would take?" 30 days, Richard replied without hesitation. "In 30 days, I can turn anyone into someone more sophisticated, genuine, and authentic than you've ever been." Tiffany's confident smile faltered for a moment. "That's ridiculous." "Afraid to lose?" Richard pressed, sensing a crack in her composure. "If I succeed, you terminate all your contracts with Vanguard Kucha. If I fail, I'll double their value." A circle of spectators had gathered, and Richard could see phones recording every word. Tiffany glanced around, realizing she was cornered. Refusing the bet now would make her look weak. "Fine," she finally said, extending her hand. "But I choose the wedding date, and it has to be a real ceremony. Vows, reception, the works. No courthouse signatures." Richard shook her hand, feeling the chill of her fingers against his palm. "Deal." As the crowd buzzed with excitement over the unusual wager, Richard began questioning his sanity. What on earth had he just done? The next morning was unusually cold when Maggie woke up in her makeshift shelter under the awning of an abandoned storefront in downtown New York. At 28, her face still carried traces of beauty that life on the streets hadn't entirely erased. Her honey-colored eyes, though tired, retained a spark of determination that intrigued anyone who took the time to truly see her. Adjusting the old, worn-out coat she used as a blanket, Maggie watched as the street began to stir. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, and hurried executives passed by with their coffee cups, all careful not to make eye contact with her. Adjusting the old, worn-out coat she used as a makeshift blanket, Maggie watched the street come to life. Shopkeepers were unlocking their doors, while hurried executives passed by clutching their coffee cups, avoiding eye contact with her, as if she didn't exist. "Good morning, Mrs. Susan," Maggie called out to the elderly woman, opening her small flower shop nearby. Mrs. Susan was one of the few who treated Maggie with kindness, sometimes offering a hot cup of coffee or a few unsold flowers. "Good morning, dear Maggie," Mrs. Susan replied warmly, her face lighting up with a smile. "Come inside and have some coffee. It's far too cold to be out here today." Grateful for the warmth, Maggie stepped into the flower shop and wrapped her hands around the steaming cup. As she sipped, she helped Mrs. Susan organize the new flower arrangements that had just arrived. Despite her rough, calloused hands, Maggie handled the delicate blooms with surprising grace. "You have a real gift, you know," Mrs. Susan remarked, watching Maggie expertly pair colors and textures. "It's amazing how someone as talented as you—" "Please, Mrs. Susan," Maggie interrupted gently. "You know how life works. Sometimes it throws us into situations we never asked for." Across town, Richard Monroe was driving his Porsche through the bustling streets, something he rarely did himself. After a restless night, the plan he had concocted in a fit of anger now seemed riddled with complications. "Are you sure about this, sir?" asked James, his driver, following in another car. "Maybe we should try another area." "No," Richard snapped, cutting him off. "It has to be someone who represents the complete opposite of Tiffany, someone she would never imagine fitting into her world." As Richard scanned the sidewalks, observing people starting their daily routines, something caught his eye. Through the window of a small flower shop, he saw a young woman arranging flowers. Her movements carried a natural elegance that starkly contrasted with her simple, worn clothes. Pulling his car over, Richard ignored James's protests about the neighborhood's safety and strode into the shop. The soft jingle of the bell announced his arrival, making both Maggie and Mrs. Susan turn toward him. "Good morning," he said, his deep voice filling the small space. "I'd like to buy some flowers." Maggie kept her head down, continuing her work, while Mrs. Susan approached the sharply dressed man. But Richard's attention remained fixed on Maggie. "Young lady," he said, addressing her directly, You have a special touch with these flowers." Surprised, Maggie looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. Richard felt a strange sensation, a spark of recognition he couldn't quite explain. "They're just flowers," she replied simply, her voice calm yet dignified. "They do all the work themselves." "I disagree," Richard countered, stepping closer. "The artistry lies in how you arrange them. Do you have formal training in landscaping?" A faint, sad smile appeared on Maggie's lips. "No, sir. I don't have training in anything." It was then Richard noticed the details he had overlooked: the worn-out clothes, scuffed shoes, and calloused hands. Slowly, he began piecing everything together. "Do you work here?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Not exactly," Maggie said, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Susan. "I help out sometimes when Mrs. Susan lets me have a warm cup of coffee." Richard's heartbeat quickened. He had found her, the perfect person for his wager, someone who, despite her circumstances, radiated a natural dignity he hadn't expected to find. "And your name?" he asked hesitantly, realizing he didn't know it. "Maggie," she replied. "Maggie." He repeated the name, savoring its sound. "I have a proposal for you. It might sound crazy, but I ask you to hear me out till the end." Mrs. Susan, sensing the gravity of the situation, moved protectively closer to Maggie. Richard noticed her gesture and appreciated the care the woman showed for her charge. "Don't worry, Mrs. Susan," he said, pulling a business card from his pocket and handing it to the florist. "I'm Richard Monroe, from Vanguard Couture, and I believe I can offer Maggie a unique opportunity." Maggie's eyes widened as she recognized his name. Even living on the streets, it was impossible not to know who Richard Monroe was, a constant figure in headlines and magazine covers. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Richard took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could alter not just his plans, but possibly 2 lives. The small flower shop seemed to amplify the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. He adjusted his tie, a reflex he always had before sealing an important deal. But this was unlike any negotiation he'd ever conducted. "First," he began, "I'd like to discuss this somewhere more suitable. There's a cafe nearby where we can talk in private," he suggested. Maggie exchanged a glance with Mrs. Susan, who nodded subtly. "Go ahead, dear. I'll be here if you need anything." The cafe was just 2 blocks away, a stylish establishment Maggie had often admired from afar, gazing at the beautifully crafted pastries displayed in the window. As they entered, the staff cast curious glances at the mismatched pair, him in a flawless Italian suit, her in worn, simple clothing. Maggie was taken aback by Richard's gentlemanly gesture as he pulled out a chair for her. Once they placed their orders, an espresso for him and a hot chocolate for her, he began to explain. "Miss Maggie, what I'm about to propose might sound outrageous, but please hear me out." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need to get married within 30 days. Maggie nearly choked on her hot chocolate. "Excuse me?" she asked, incredulous. "It's a complicated situation," he continued. "I made a bet that I can transform anyone into a high society lady within 30 days. And when I saw you today, something told me you might be the perfect person for this." Maggie's honey-brown eyes locked onto his, trying to decipher if this was some cruel joke. "So, let me get this straight. You want to marry me to win a bet?" "Yes," Richard answered bluntly. "But there's more to it than that. I'm willing to offer you a substantial sum of money that will completely change your life. After the 30 days, you're free to go your own way, with enough resources to never have to sleep on the streets again." Maggie set her cup on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "Why me? Surely hundreds of women would be thrilled to marry someone like you, even for a month." Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice. Exactly. I don't desire someone who is driven by a desire to rise in society. I need someone who can prove that true elegance comes from within, not from designer clothes or a famous last name. And if I fail, if I turn out to be a disaster and you lose your bet, then I'll face the consequences, he replied simply. But something tells me you won't fail. I've seen how you work with flowers, the natural grace in your movements, the innate elegance in you that many socialites could never buy, no matter how much they spend. Maggie remained silent, processing everything. Her mind raced with ideas. On one hand, the proposal seemed absurd, almost insulting. On the other hand, it presented a unique opportunity to transform her life. How much? She finally asked. How much are you offering? Richard scribbled a figure on a napkin and slid it across the table. Maggie's eyes widened at the number of zeros. This is more money than I've ever seen in my life, she whispered. And it's yours, he assured her. Regardless of the outcome, I guarantee it. All I ask is 30 days of your life and your dedication to learning what I have to teach. Maggie gazed out the cafe window, watching people rush by on the busy sidewalk. How many times had she dreamed of a chance to change her life? Yet, this felt almost too surreal. What if, she hesitated, what if I agree? What are the rules? What exactly do you expect from me? First, Richard began, we'll need to set some ground rules. You'll live in my house during this period. You'll have lessons in etiquette, diction, fashion, and social behavior. Maggie would be introduced to classical music, fine art and literature, a full immersion into what is considered high society. And what about the marriage itself? She asked, her cheeks tinged with a soft blush. Richard quickly assured her that the marriage would be convenient. We'll have separate rooms, and your privacy will be completely respected. The only time we'll need to show any intimacy is during social events. Even then, just enough to make it look convincing. Maggie took another sip of her now lukewarm hot chocolate, her mind working furiously, weighing the pros and cons. May I make a condition? She finally asked. Richard raised an eyebrow in surprise. What would that be? I want part of the money to go toward creating a program to help the homeless, she said firmly. With that, many good people who just need a chance, much like the one you're giving me now, will finally have an opportunity. A genuine smile, his first since entering the cafe, appeared on Richard's lips. Consider it done. Any other conditions? Richard asked. Maggie straightened in her chair, and for a brief moment, Richard saw a glimpse of the strong woman she could become. Yes, I want your word that, no matter what happens, you'll never humiliate me publicly. I've endured enough humiliation in my life. You have my word, Richard responded solemnly, extending his hand. Then it's a deal. Maggie looked at his outstretched hand, realizing she was about to change the course of her life entirely. Taking a deep breath, she shook his hand. We have a deal, she said, her voice steady. Richard's penthouse was more opulent than anything Maggie had ever seen. The private elevator opened directly into a living room with soaring ceilings, contemporary art, and designer furniture. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased an endless ocean view. Sandra, Richard called, and a woman in her 50s dressed impeccably appeared promptly. This is Maggie. She'll be staying with us for a while. Please show her to the East guest room and make sure she has everything she needs. Maggie followed Sandra down the spacious hallways, feeling almost insignificant amidst such grandeur. The guest room was larger than any apartment she had lived in before. At the center was a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, and a private balcony offered a stunning ocean view. The bathroom is through here, Sandra said, indicating a door. The closet is empty for now, but Mr. Monroe has arranged for some basic clothing items. A stylist will come later for more precise fittings. Maggie opened the closet door to find several pieces still with their tags. The sight of the designer labels almost brought her to tears. These were brands she had only ever seen in magazines she occasionally browsed through at newsstands. "Sandra," she called hesitantly, "can you help me with something?" The housekeeper, who was about to leave, turned back with a kind smile. "Of course, miss." "I don't know how to use half the things in that bathroom," Maggie admitted, her cheeks flushing, "and some of these clothes look so delicate I'm afraid I'll ruin them." To her surprise, Sandra didn't show a hint of judgment. Instead, her smile grew even warmer. "Don't worry, dear. I'll help you with everything. First, let's get you a relaxing bath. After that, we can look at the clothes together." An hour later, Maggie hardly recognized the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Her hair, now clean and treated with luxurious products, gleamed like it hadn't in years. Her skin, after a gentle exfoliation, looked clearer and softer. Sandra had chosen a simple yet elegant light blue dress for her, and it suited her perfectly. "Mr. Monroe has requested your presence for lunch," Sandra informed. "Are you ready?" Maggie took a deep breath. Adjusting her dress for what felt like the 10th time, she replied, "I think so." In the dining room, Richard was on the phone when Maggie entered. Upon noticing her, he abruptly ended the call. For a moment, he stood in silence, observing her transformation. "Impressive," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Sandra did an excellent job," he added. "Thank you," Maggie responded, unsure how to act. "I mean, thank you for all of this. It's a bit overwhelming, or rather, daunting." "First lesson," Richard said, motioning for her to sit. "Never apologize for using an English word when it better expresses what you mean. In high society, it's considered sophisticated." Maggie tried to commit this detail to memory. As she sat, Richard gently corrected her posture. "Back straight, always, and the napkin goes on your lap as soon as you sit." Lunch was served in 3 courses, something Maggie had never experienced before. Maggie couldn't quite identify the flavors of each dish, which were like miniature works of art. "Tomorrow we'll start early," Richard informed her as they savored dessert. "At 8, you'll have your first etiquette lesson with Mrs. Cecilia. At 10, diction training with Professor Raymond. In the afternoon, an image consultant. And at 5, an art history session." Maggie nearly choked on her chocolate mousse. "All that in one day?" "We only have 30 days, Richard reminded her. "There's a lot of work ahead." "Yes, Mr. Monroe," she replied. He corrected her. "Richard, if we're getting married, even temporarily, you'll need to call me by my first name." "Richard," she repeated, feeling strange about the sudden familiarity. "Can I ask you a personal question?" He nodded. "Why is it so important to prove something to your ex-fiancée? You already have everything: money, power, success. Why care what she thinks?" Richard set his fork down, his face taking on a thoughtful expression. "It's not just about her. It's about proving to myself that I can look beyond appearances, that I can create something real, even starting from nothing." "And I'm your starting from nothing project?" Maggie concluded, her voice tinged with bitterness. "No," Richard responded quickly, surprising even himself with the intensity of his answer. "You're my partner in this. We're creating something together, and I believe we can surprise everyone, including ourselves." A reflective silence fell over the table, broken only by the soft clinking of cutlery. Maggie watched Richard discreetly, noticing for the first time how his features softened when his corporate guard was down. "Well," she finally said, sitting up straighter and adjusting her napkin with exaggerated formality, eliciting a faint smile from Richard. "I'd better rest, then. It seems like tomorrow will be a long day. No, no, Mrs. Cecilia's voice rang through the living room. The dessert spoon should be used from the edge to the center, never in circular motions. Maggie took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure as she started over for what felt like the 10th time. It was only 8:30 in the morning, and she was already exhausted. The etiquette instructor, a French woman in her 60s with impeccable poise, seemed to find fault in every minor detail. Mademoiselle, Cecilia continued, her French accent becoming more pronounced as her irritation grew, you must understand that every action at the table tells a story about who you are. The way you hold your utensils, how you bring the napkin to your lips, all of it speaks to your upbringing. But there are so many rules, Maggie protested softly. Different utensils for each dish, specific glasses for every type of wine. And you will learn them all, a deep male voice interrupted. Richard was standing in the doorway, watching the scene with interest. How is she doing, Mrs. Cecilia? He asked, stepping further into the room. The Frenchwoman hesitated for a moment. She has a natural grace that's quite remarkable, she finally admitted. But we still have much work to do. Maggie felt her cheeks flush at the unexpected compliment. Richard approached the set table, his eyes scanning the arrangement laid out for the lesson. Show me what you've learned so far, he said, sitting across from her. With extra care, Maggie demonstrated the correct sequence for using the utensils, the proper way to hold a wine glass, and how to fold the napkin after use. To her surprise, she performed all the steps without a single mistake. See? Richard smiled, turning to Mrs. Cecilia. She's a quick learner. The next session, led by a language coach named Raymond, proved equally challenging. The expert made Maggie repeat countless words she had been mispronouncing. You have a naturally melodious voice, Raymond observed, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. But you need to learn how to modulate it properly. In high society, tone is just as important as word choice. At lunch, Maggie began applying everything she had learned so far. Richard watched her with a mix of admiration and curiosity, noting her effort to maintain perfect posture and use the utensils correctly. You know, he remarked as he discreetly checked a small card Mrs. Cecilia had left with the correct order of utensils. You're doing much better than I expected. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an admission that your expectations were very low, Maggie responded, surprising him with her wit. Richard laughed, a genuine sound Maggie hadn't heard before. Maybe a bit of both, he admitted. But there's something about you, a remarkable ability to adapt. That afternoon, during an image consultancy session, Maggie faced yet another challenge. Sophia, the consultant, was a sophisticated, straightforward individual who didn't hold back. Your skin tone is stunning, Sophia declared, studying Maggie closely. And your almond-shaped eyes are quite striking. We'll work with colors that highlight these natural features. For hours, Maggie tried on dozens of outfits, learned which colors suited her best, which fabrics were appropriate for different occasions, and how to craft a unique personal image. Remember, Sophia instructed, we're not trying to make you look like anyone else. True elegance comes from authenticity, but with refinement. By the end of the day, during an art history lesson, Maggie surprised everyone with her intuitive understanding of color and composition, a skill she'd honed through her work with flowers. It's fascinating how you connect Monet's colors with the flowers you know, the professor commented. It shows a natural artistic sensibility. That night, Maggie finally retreated to her room. Her back ached from the effort of maintaining perfect posture, and her mind was overwhelmed with information. As she walked past Richard's office, she heard voices. She's remarkable, Mrs. Cecilia was saying. She has a natural elegance that can't be taught. With the right training, Richard intervened, his tone not harsh but cautionary. We still have a long way to go. Maggie smiled faintly as she continued to her room. Standing in front of the mirror, she stared at the woman reflected back at her. She was still herself, but there was something different in her gaze, a blend of determination and hope she hadn't seen in a long time. On the balcony, overlooking the city lights, Maggie thought about how much her life had changed in just 2 days. Richard's words echoed in her mind. "You're a partner in this project." "Partner," she whispered to herself, savoring the word. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than just a transformation project. Maybe, just maybe, she could truly surprise everyone, even herself. It had been a week since Maggie began her intensive training, and the transformation was undeniable. The woman staring back at her in the mirror was almost unrecognizable. She wasn't just wearing a stunning midnight blue dress that hugged her curves with subtle elegance. Her posture and expression exuded a newfound confidence. "You look absolutely breathtaking," said Laura, Richard's sister, who had arrived early to help with the preparations for the Vanguard Couture charity dinner. This was the first time Maggie would officially be introduced to society as Richard Monroe's fiancée. "I'm terrified," she admitted, fiddling for what felt like the 100th time with the pearl necklace draped around her neck. "What if I mess up, or pick up the wrong fork, or—" "Maggie," Laura interrupted gently, placing her hands reassuringly on her shoulders. "Relax. You've spent the entire week preparing for this. Besides, no one expects you to be perfect." "Exactly. Except maybe my brother." Maggie's heart raced at the mention of Richard, despite her attempts to rationalize it as pre-event nerves. "Speaking of him," Laura added with a knowing sparkle in her eyes, "did you know he cancelled 3 meetings this week just to check on your progress?" Before Maggie could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway. Dressed impeccably in a tailored tuxedo, he paused, taking her in. His green eyes widened slightly, a fleeting but telling reaction. "You look—" he began, but trailed off as if the right words eluded him. "Horrible?" Maggie asked, her uncertainty seeping through. "Magnificent," he corrected, his voice softer than usual. "But something's missing." Reaching into his pocket, Richard pulled out a velvet box and opened it to reveal a pair of sapphire and diamond earrings, glinting under the room's light. "They belong to my mother," he explained, stepping closer. "I thought they'd match your eyes perfectly." With slightly trembling hands, he helped her put them on, his fingers brushing her skin in the process. The brief touch sent an electric charge through Maggie's body. Laura observed the moment with a knowing smile. "Well, I'll check if everything is ready downstairs," she said. "Don't take too long. The guests will be arriving soon." Once Laura left, the room was filled with a charged silence. Richard and Maggie met each other's gaze through the mirror. "Nervous?" he asked. "More than I should be," she admitted. "There are so many important people." "Forget the important people," Richard said, turning her gently to face him. "Tonight, you are the most important person in that room. Just remember, shoulders back, chin slightly raised." "And genuine smiles only," Maggie finished, recalling Mrs. Cecilia's lessons. "Exactly," he said with a smile, offering his arm. "Ready?" By the time they descended to the hotel ballroom, it was already packed. Maggie felt every pair of eyes turning toward her, some curious, others openly critical. In the distance, she spotted Tiffany, dazzling in a red dress, whispering something to her friends while casting an appraising glance in Maggie's direction. "Just breathe," Richard murmured in her ear. "You were born for this." The initial introductions presented a significant challenge. Maggie greeted dozens of people, each interaction a test of poise and composure. All while maintaining the perfect smile she had worked so hard to perfect. With perfect posture and a relaxed demeanor she had practiced diligently, Maggie stepped into the unfamiliar world with surprising ease. To her amazement, some of the skills she had honed on the streets, like reading people and adapting swiftly to changing scenarios, proved to be incredibly valuable in this environment. She could sense whether someone was genuine or just pretending, and adjusted her approach accordingly. "Maggie, darling," a saccharine voice chimed in. It was Tiffany, approaching with her entourage of friends. "What an interesting surprise to see you here. Richard always did have a peculiar taste for surprises." Maggie felt Richard stiffen beside her, but before he could respond, she replied, with a calmness she didn't realize she possessed. "Tiffany, what a pleasure. Richard has told me so much about you, especially how you helped him appreciate the value of authenticity in relationships." Tiffany's smile faltered briefly. A few people nearby suppressed laughter, clearly amused by Maggie's graceful yet pointed response. "Well," Tiffany recovered quickly, "I hope you're adjusting well to our world. It must be challenging." "Actually," Maggie said, maintaining the serene smile she had rehearsed tirelessly, "I found there are more similarities between all worlds than differences. At the end of the day, we all seek the same things: respect, dignity, and true love." Richard, observing the silent exchange between the two women, felt an inexplicable pride swelling in his chest. Maggie not only maintained her poise with elegance, but also demonstrated a wisdom that transcended traditional etiquette lessons. The night continued with Maggie surprising everyone, including herself, with her ability to navigate the social scene. She danced with Richard, engaged in conversations with prominent business people, and even contributed insightful comments during a discussion about the opening of a new art gallery at the museum. Later, as the last guests began to leave, Richard found her standing on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. "You were amazing tonight," he said, stepping up beside her. "You sound surprised," she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I am. Not because of how well you handled yourself. I already knew you could. I'm surprised by how proud you made me feel to have you by my side." Maggie turned to face him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. For a moment, something passed between them, an energy neither was ready to acknowledge. "Richard," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "is this still just a bet to you?" Before he could answer, Laura appeared in the doorway. "Richard, the Vogue representatives want one last photo with you two." The moment shattered, but Maggie's question lingered, unanswered, yet impossible to ignore. The next morning, gossip websites and society columns were buzzing with one topic. Richard Monroe's mysterious fiancée had captivated the elite. Who is the woman who stole the billionaire's heart? The Cinderella of the 21st century, the headlines speculated endlessly. Maggie flipped through the articles on her tablet while sitting on the balcony of her room. Sandra arrived with breakfast. "The phones haven't stopped ringing," the housekeeper remarked, pouring coffee into a delicate porcelain cup. "Mr. Monroe has already turned down 5 interview requests this morning." "It's all so surreal," Maggie sighed, picking up a piece of toast. "Last night, for a moment, I almost believed it was real, that I actually belonged in that world." Sandra watched her with a motherly warmth. "Who says you don't? I saw how you carried yourself. It wasn't just about manners or etiquette. There was something more." Maggie was about to respond when raised voices from Richard's office caught her attention. Curiosity drew her to the slightly ajar door. "You're playing with fire, Richard," Laura's voice warned. "I've seen the way you look at her. This stopped being just a bet, didn't it?" "Don't be ridiculous," Richard replied, but there was an uncertainty in his voice that Maggie had never noticed before. "It's just a business arrangement." A business arrangement. Laura laughed bitterly. Sure, keep telling yourself that. So why did you give her our mom's earrings? In 15 years of being with Tiffany, you never once offered her anything that belonged to Mom. A heavy silence hung in the air after the observation. She's different, Richard finally admitted. Her genuine nature surprises me. Last night, when she stood up to Tiffany with such grace and wisdom, it was like... He hesitated, searching for the right words. Laura finished his thought, softly. Like you found someone who sees beyond your wealth and power. Maggie quietly stepped away from the door. Her heart raced erratically as she hurried back to her room. Her mind swirled with a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. This story is being listened to by lovely and sincere audiences. So which beautiful city are our audience from? Leave your name in the comments below. Hours later, during her art history class, Maggie struggled to focus. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Richard's gaze from the night before, the subtle way he had defended her throughout the evening, and how his fingers had trembled slightly as he placed the earrings on her ears. Miss Maggie, the professor's voice snapped her back to reality. Are you all right? She stammered. I'm sorry, Before she could finish, Sandra entered the classroom and interrupted. Richard is requesting your presence in the Winter Garden. The Winter Garden was one of the most stunning spots in the penthouse. A glass structure housed dozens of rare orchid species and other exotic flowers. Maggie found Richard sitting on a wooden bench, admiring a particularly beautiful arrangement of blue orchids. You wanted to see me? She asked softly. Richard stood immediately, and Maggie noticed he seemed less formal than usual. He wore only a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and tailored slacks. Yes, he said, gesturing to the seat beside him on the bench. I wanted to personally congratulate you on how you handled last night. You exceeded all expectations. His tone was sincere, but Maggie couldn't help but ask, whose expectations? A faint smile appeared on Richard's lips. Both mine and theirs, he admitted, but mostly mine. Maggie hesitated before speaking, idly toying with a fallen petal in her lap. You know, she began, when you live on the streets, you learn to read people. It's a matter of survival. And last night, I realized something interesting. Richard tilted his head, genuinely intrigued. What's that? He asked. All those people with their expensive clothes and rehearsed smiles, many of them are just as lonely as I was on the streets, she said, her voice quiet but steady. The difference is, my loneliness was physical. Theirs is emotional. Richard listened in silence, clearly taken aback by the depth of her insight. Including you, she added, summoning the courage to look him in the eye. Despite building an empire, you maintain a distance from everyone, she said. Why? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Richard stood and walked over to one of the orchids. Do you know why I chose this spot for our conversation? He asked, seemingly shifting the topic. Because it was here that I realized something last night, after everyone had left. What was it? Maggie asked, curiosity flickering in her voice. That you're like these orchids, he said, gently touching a petal. Fragile and delicate at first glance, but incredibly strong and resilient. And like them, you bloom most beautifully when you're in your natural environment, being your authentic self. Maggie felt her heart quicken. Richard, He interrupted gently, sitting down beside her, closer this time. Let me finish, he said. Last night, when you faced Tiffany, it wasn't etiquette or behavior lessons speaking. It was her essence, her true nature, and it was extraordinary. Their eyes met, locking in a silent connection. For a moment, all social barriers, every deal and wager, seemed to dissolve like snow under the sun. Richard hesitated, raising his hand to gently touch Maggie's face, a tenderness that sharply contrasted his usual composed demeanor. "The bet," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is still about the bet, isn't it?" Before Richard could respond, the sharp click of heels on the marble floor shattered the moment. Laura appeared at the entrance to the conservatory. Her face was tense with worry. "Richard," she called urgently, "Tiffany is live right now, being interviewed by the Fashion News. You need to see this." In the penthouse's media room, Richard, Maggie, and Laura watched the interview unfold on the massive TV screen. Tiffany looked flawless, dressed in a pristine Chanel ensemble. Her calculated smile was directed squarely at the camera. "Of course, I was surprised," Tiffany told the host, her melodic voice laced with fake concern. "I mean, everyone knows about the bet, right? Richard Monroe, the country's most eligible billionaire, wagered that he could turn anyone into a high society lady in just 30 days. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Richard visibly paled. "A bet?" the host asked, her eyes glinting with the anticipation of a scandal. "What kind of bet was that, Tiffany?" "Oh," Tiffany feigned surprise, raising her hand to her lips. "I thought everyone knew. It happened during the Vogue launch after we broke up. Richard, in his usual arrogance, bet that money and power could buy anything. Even a marriage of convenience with, well, you know." Laura abruptly turned off the TV, plunging the room into a heavy silence. "I can explain," Richard began, turning toward Maggie. "Explain what exactly?" Maggie asked, her voice unnervingly calm. "That I was just a wager, or that you plan to use me to prove a point?" "It's not that simple," he said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "It's very simple." Maggie stood, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was naive to think that this could be more than just a business arrangement." "Maggie, please." Richard tried to approach her, but she stepped back. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you know what's worse? It's not the public humiliation. It's not even the bet itself. It's realizing that, after everything I've been through, I can still be this foolish." Laura, who had been silently watching the exchange, intervened. "Maggie, my brother might have started this as a bet, but things changed. I've seen how he what?" Maggie interrupted. "How he enjoyed turning me into his personal project. How he get to prove his point to his ex-fiancée." Richard stepped forward, his face etched with anguish. "You don't understand. What started as a bet turned into something real. Last night, in the garden." "Don't," Maggie raised her hand, cutting him off. "Don't make this even more humiliating than it already is." She walked to the window, gazing down at the city below. The lights were starting to flicker on in the twilight, reminding her of the nights she spent on the streets, watching other people's lives through their brightly lit windows. In a way, she was still on the outside, looking into a world she didn't truly belong to. "You know," she continued, her voice softer now, "when you found me in that flower shop, I thought it was a miracle, a chance not just to change my life, but to prove to myself that I could be more than my circumstances. How foolish of me." "You're not foolish," Richard said firmly. "You're the most genuine and authentic person I've ever met, and that's why—" The sound of Laura's phone vibrating interrupted him. She glanced at the screen, her expression turning serious. "The hashtag #JabMiracleBetMonroe is already trending," the press assistant informed. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them, her gaze was steady, filled with newfound determination. "All right then," she uttered, surprising Richard and Laura. "Let's give them a statement, but on my terms." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. "You wanted to prove you could turn anyone into a high society lady." "Fine," Maggie replied. "We'll prove it, but not to win some bet or embarrass Tiffany. We'll do it to show that transformation doesn't have to come at the cost of losing who you are." Maggie stepped closer to Richard, stopping just inches from him. "I'm continuing with this," she said firmly. "Not for you or the bet, but for everyone who, like me, has been judged by their circumstances instead of their character. When this is all over, when I've proven my worth, it'll be on my terms." Richard stared at her, seeing for the first time not just the woman he was trying to change, but someone transforming on her own, using the tools he'd only handed her. "And what are your terms?" he asked quietly. "First," Maggie began, her voice unwavering, "no lies. We admit the bet, but we'll show people that growth and change are possible. Second, that social project we discussed, I want it launched immediately. And third," she paused, locking eyes with him, "when all of this is done, you'll have to decide what matters more, winning a bet or gaining something real." Laura watched the scene unfold with a mix of pride and worry. Whether it was a bet or not, her future sister-in-law was proving to be far more than any of them had anticipated. "Do we have a deal then?" Maggie extended her hand to Richard. He looked at her outstretched hand, then at her resolute face, and something shifted inside him. It was no longer about the bet, Tiffany, or even proving a point to society. It was about something far more profound and frightening. It was about his heart, recognizing a truth his mind wasn't ready to accept. The press conference was scheduled for the following day at the Vanguard Couture Auditorium. Maggie stood in the dressing room, examining her reflection in the mirror. Her outfit was understated, yet polished enough to convey confidence. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked, knocking lightly before entering. "We could find another way to handle this." Maggie smiled at him through the mirror. "Running away is how I survived on the streets," she said. "But now, it's time to face things head-on." The makeup artist discreetly left the room, leaving them alone. Richard stepped closer, stopping behind her. In the mirror's reflection, they made a striking pair. Him in his flawless navy suit, her exuding a calm, poised elegance. "You know," he said softly, "when I made that bet, I was blinded by anger and pride. I never imagined I'd meet someone who'd end up teaching me more than I could teach them." "And what have I taught you?" Maggie asked, turning to face him directly. "That true elegance has nothing to do with expensive clothes or prestigious last names," he replied. "It's about dignity, staying true to yourself, even when the world tries to change you." A faint blush colored Maggie's cheeks, but before she could respond, Laura burst into the room, her expression urgent. "Is everyone ready?" she announced. The room was packed. Journalists from every major outlet and representatives from top brands, all eyes were on the stage. "Tiffany?" Maggie asked. "Front row," Laura confirmed with a venomous smile. Maggie took a deep breath and stood up. "Perfect. Let's give them something to really smile about." The hum of chatter in the auditorium faded as Maggie walked onto the stage, Richard following closely behind. Every move of the couple, now the talk of the town, was captured by the constant flashing of cameras. "Good afternoon," Maggie began, her voice steady and confident as she spoke into the microphone. "Thank you all for being here. Over the past few days, there's been a lot of speculation about my relationship with Richard Monroe and a supposed bet. Today, I'm here to provide you with the complete truth. The whole truth." In the front row, Tiffany shifted in her seat, her triumphant smile beginning to waver under Maggie's poise. "Yes, there was a bet," Maggie continued. "Richard Monroe bet he could turn someone like me, someone living on the streets, into a proper lady of society. But something unexpected happened along the way. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. We both changed. I learned about etiquette, art, and culture. I learned how to navigate social events and even appreciate fine wines. But Richard learned that there are things money can't buy. He learned that even those who have nothing can still hold on to their dignity and values. Standing just a few steps behind her, Richard felt his heart race. Every word Maggie spoke reflected the internal changes he had gone through. And that's why today, we're not only revealing the truth about the bet, Maggie said, but also announcing the launch of Project Rebirth, a new initiative by Vanguard Couture to empower vulnerable individuals. This program will provide not only professional training, but also a real chance for transformation. A ripple of approval spread through the crowd. Some journalists were already typing furiously on their laptops. As for our relationship, Maggie added, turning to look at Richard, this goes beyond any bet or business deal. It's about two individuals who, through unforeseen turns of events, discovered something they weren't seeking. Tiffany abruptly rose from her seat, her face a mask of barely concealed frustration. Her plan to humiliate Maggie had backfired into a stunning victory for her rival. Any questions? Maggie concluded with a calm smile. Hands shot up immediately. For the next hour, Maggie and Richard answered every question with a disarming honesty that even the most skeptical journalists couldn't ignore. What could have been a scandal about a bet was instead becoming a story of mutual growth and transformation. Later, in the car ride home, Richard reached for Maggie's hand. "You were incredible in there," he said, "but there's one thing I can't stop thinking about." "What's that?" she asked. "You said our relationship goes beyond any bet. Do you really believe that?" Maggie looked at their intertwined hands, warmth flooding her as it always did when she was near him. "I believe some bets take us places we never imagined," she said softly. "What about you, Asia? Are you prepared to forfeit this wager in order to acquire something even more valuable?" Richard held her gaze, realizing for the first time in his life that he was willing to lose something to gain everything. The community center in the heart of the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Vanguard Couture's team successfully transformed the abandoned space into a state-of-the-art training facility in just 2 weeks. Rows of brand-new sewing machines were neatly lined up, and the adjacent room was equipped with modern computers for digital design. Maggie walked through the space, overseeing the final preparations for the launch of Project Rebirth. As she meticulously inspected every detail, her heels clicked against the newly installed floor. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her hair swept into an effortless bun, a look that perfectly balanced her new role with her humble beginnings. "Has Mrs. Helen arrived yet?" she asked one of the assistants. "I want her to be the first to see all of this." Mrs. Helen was the florist who had taken Maggie in on that fateful day when Richard found her. Now she was going to be one of the instructors in the program, teaching floral art and design to the students. "I'm here, my dear." The familiar voice came from behind her. Mrs. Helen stood at the door, her eyes welling up as she took in the space. "This is more than I ever imagined." Maggie embraced the older woman warmly. "And this is just the beginning. Everyone who comes through these doors will have the same opportunity I had, not just to learn a profession, but to rediscover their own worth." "Speaking of worth," Mrs. Helen said with a wise smile, "I've seen the way Richard looks at you during the project meetings. That man is no longer pretending, Maggie." Before Maggie could respond, Richard entered the main hall. He wasn't wearing his usual blazer. Instead, his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing a more casual side of him that few ever got to see. His eyes instantly locked onto Maggie's, as if they were drawn to each other like magnets. "The first group of students has arrived," he announced, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "They're a little nervous, but eager to get started." Maggie followed Richard to the reception area where a group of 15 women waited. Each had their own story, but all shared the same hope for transformation. Her eyes glistened as she recognized a few familiar faces from the streets she used to frequent. "Welcome to Project Rebirth," Maggie began, her voice filled with emotion. "Each of you is here because, like me a few weeks ago, you're ready for a change. But I want you to understand one thing. We're not here to erase who you are. We're here to add new possibilities to what you already are." Richard watched Maggie quietly as she spoke. Every gesture, every word she said, radiated a sincerity that no etiquette class could teach. Yes, she had transformed, but her essence remained untouched, making her all the more extraordinary. The morning was filled with a flurry of activities. Maggie led the new students on a tour of the center, introducing the instructors and explaining the program. Richard, to everyone's surprise, stayed the entire time, personally interacting with the participants, a rarity for a CEO of his stature. By late afternoon, after the students had left and most of the staff had gone home, Maggie found Richard alone in the sewing room, pensively observing one of the machines. "A penny for your thoughts," she said softly as she approached. "I was just thinking about how much things change," he replied, turning to face her. "A month ago, all I wanted was to prove something to Tiffany, to the world, to myself." "And now?" Maggie prompted, her heart involuntarily speeding up. "Now, I realize what I was truly looking for," he said, taking a step toward her. "You know, there are only 10 days left until the deadline for the bet." Maggie felt a pang in her chest. "And does that still matter?" she asked. "Yes," Richard said, surprising her. "But not for the reasons it did before. It matters because I need to decide before the deadline. A decision that could change everything." "What decision?" Maggie inquired in a barely audible whisper. Richard was about to answer when the sound of heels clicking down the hallway interrupted them. Laura appeared at the door, her eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and concern. "Sorry to interrupt," she said quickly, "but you all need to see this." Tiffany just announced her new social project, a shameless copy of Project Rebirth, but with triple the investment and backing from all the big-name brands. Maggie and Richard exchanged glances. What was supposed to be a day of celebration had just turned into yet another challenge. But this time, it was different. It wasn't about proving a point or winning a bet. It was about protecting something genuine they had built together. "She's not going to succeed," Maggie said with conviction. "It's not about money or famous brands. It's about authenticity," she continued, "and genuinely caring about people." Richard reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "No, she won't succeed," he said, "because she doesn't have you." The Vanguard Couture boardroom buzzed with the presence of the entire executive team. Projected graphs on the wall showed a sharp decline in the company's ratings since Tiffany's competing project was announced. Laura presented the numbers, her concern evident. "Our key partner brands are threatening to cut ties," she explained, switching to the next slide. "Tiffany's project offers exclusivity and international exposure. Some have already hinted they're planning to move over." Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, though the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed his unease. Maggie, seated beside him, watched the room with a calmness that surprised even herself. "If I may," she said, rising gracefully, "I think we're looking at this the wrong way." All eyes turned toward her. Dressed in a tailored burgundy suit, Maggie exuded a confidence she hadn't fully realized she possessed until that moment. "Tiffany is banking on money and connections," she continued, "but we have something she'll never have. True purpose. Our students aren't just numbers on a marketing spreadsheet. They're real people with real stories. She stepped toward the projector screen and switched the image to photos from the first day of Project Rebirth's classes. "Look at Helen," she said, pointing to a smiling woman standing beside a sewing machine. She raised 5 kids on her own, making small clothing repairs. Now she's learning high fashion and has already received 13 custom orders for evening gowns. Richard watched Maggie with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name just yet. "What do you propose?" one of the board members asked. "A shift in the narrative," Maggie replied confidently. "Instead of competing on numbers, let's showcase real results. I'm proposing a benefit fashion show, but not like anything that's been done before. Our students won't just be the seamstresses, they'll be the models too." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Richard sat up straighter in his chair, intrigued. "Imagine this," Maggie said, her eyes alight with passion. "Real women with real stories, wearing pieces they helped create. It won't just be a fashion show, it'll be a celebration of transformation and authenticity." Laura was the first to smile. "That's brilliant. Tiffany might have money and connections, but she couldn't buy authenticity." The meeting continued for another hour, with everyone contributing ideas for the event. When it finally ended, Richard asked Maggie to stay behind. "You never stop surprising me," he said once they were alone. "That's what happens when someone is given a real chance," she smiled in response. Maggie organized her notes, responding calmly. "People have incredible potential when we believe in them." "Maggie," Richard called, his voice unusually soft. "Look at me." She lifted her eyes to meet his intense gaze. "There are only 5 days left before the deadline for the bet." He stepped closer. "Do you understand what that means?" he asked, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. Maggie's heart raced. "What do you mean?" "The bet was to transform you into a proper lady of society," he explained, stopping just inches away from her. "But you've become so much more than that. You've become the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." The air between them felt electric. Maggie caught the subtle mix of sandalwood and something uniquely Richard's in his scent. "Richard, she began, but the door suddenly swung open. Sandra appeared, looking flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Tiffany is downstairs with the press." "She's here with reporters?" Richard asked, frustration evident in his tone. "What is she saying?" "She's making serious accusations about Project Rebirth," Sandra said hesitantly. "She claims the whole project is a sham, that the stories of the participants are fabricated, and even that your relationship is fake." Maggie felt her face flush with heat. "She doesn't have proof," Richard stated firmly. "She doesn't need proof," he added bitterly. "All she needs to do is plant doubt." Maggie straightened her shoulders, a fierce determination lighting up her eyes. "Then let's give her more than doubt." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, his gaze locked on hers. "I mean the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "The truth that started as a bet, but has turned into something neither you nor Tiffany can control." Without waiting for a response, Maggie turned toward the door. Before leaving, she glanced back one last time. "You wanted to turn me into a lady of society, Richard, but in the process, you've transformed my heart. Now, the question is, are you ready to deal with the consequences of that transformation?" With those words, she walked out, leaving Richard standing there with an expression of surprise, admiration, and finally, the realization of what his heart had known for some time. New York Museum of Modern Art was unrecognizable. A circular runway surrounded by orchids and wildflowers paid homage to Maggie's roots. The front rows were filled with the most influential figures in the fashion world, while strategically placed TV cameras prepared to broadcast the event live. Backstage, Maggie oversaw the final preparations, a mix of nerves and determination coursing through her. She herself would be wearing a special creation, a midnight blue gown adorned with handcrafted details made by the project's participants. Each stitch told a story of resilience. "Mrs. Helen is nervous," Sandra reported as she hurried over. Maggie smiled, recalling the florist whose life had been transformed. "Tell her she doesn't need to walk the runway. She just needs to deliver her flowers as if they're for her most special customer." Tiffany's arrival on the opposite side of the room, adorned in a striking red designer dress, captured everyone's attention. By her side, representatives from major brands waited eagerly to see which social initiative they would support. "She's brought all the big sponsors," Laura said as she joined Maggie. "Good," Maggie replied, surprising her sister-in-law. "The more important people here, the better we can reveal the truth." At that moment, Richard entered, looking flawless in his tuxedo. His eyes found Maggie's immediately, and for a brief moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade away. "Is everything ready?" he asked as he approached her. "Almost," Maggie replied, adjusting his tie instinctively. "Now, there's only one thing left for you to decide." "Decide what?" he asked, his voice low, almost challenging. "Ready to lose the bet and gain something far greater." Before Richard could respond, the lights flickered, signaling the start of the event. Maggie stepped away quickly, leaving him to his thoughts. The event opened with a moving video showcasing the transformation of the community center and the first days of its classes. The cameras captured Tiffany rolling her eyes, a gesture that caught the audience's attention. Then, the first model took to the runway. It was Alice, a seamstress who had raised 5 children on her own. She walked with grace, wearing a dress she had helped design herself. On the big screen, her story was shared in simple yet powerful words. The students of the project walked the runway one by one. While they lacked the polished strides of professional models, they carried something far more valuable: authenticity. Tiffany suddenly stood and walked backstage, where she found Maggie overseeing final preparations. "Impressive," she said with a tone of mockery. "Do you really think you can compete with me using this circus of sob stories?" Maggie turned to her calmly. "No, Tiffany, I'm not competing with you." "Oh, but you are. And for what? Richard's love." Tiffany scoffed. "Don't be naive, dear. You're still just part of a bet." "You're wrong." A firm voice interrupted. Richard stood in the doorway, his face set with determination. "The bet is over." "What do you mean?" Tiffany asked, her confidence faltering for the first time. "I mean, I lost," Richard said, his eyes fixed on Maggie. "I lost the moment I realized I couldn't turn Maggie into a society lady, because she's already so much more than that. She's genuine, true, and infinitely more elegant than any of us." A silence followed, broken only by the sound of applause from the runway. The last student had finished her walk, and the audience was on their feet, cheering. Impulsively, Tiffany muttered, "The sponsors have already made their decision." Laura appeared, holding her tablet. "They just rebirthed their contract with Vanguard Couture, and they want exclusivity with Project Rebirth." Tiffany blushed, her facade of dominance finally crumbling. Without uttering another word, Tiffany quickly turned around and departed. Maggie barely had time to process what was happening before Richard stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "You were right," he said softly. "Sometimes losing a bet takes us to places we never expected." "And sometimes losing is the biggest win," Maggie replied, but Richard gently cut her off. "Let me finish. I spent my whole life believing that power and money were all that mattered. Then you entered my life, bringing with you your genuineness and boundless compassion, completely upending my perspective." Maggie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. In the background, they could still hear the applause and celebration continuing in the main hall. "The bet officially ends tomorrow," Richard added. "But there's something I need to do today. Something that has nothing to do with bets or transformations." At that moment, all the students from the project began to enter the backstage area, each carrying bouquets of orchids, the same flowers that had brought Maggie and Richard together on that fateful day. The orchids filled the backstage with their soft fragrance, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Each student held a small bouquet, forming a circle around Maggie and Richard. Alice, with tears in her eyes, stepped forward and handed Maggie the most beautiful arrangement of all. A bouquet of blue orchids, just like the ones she had arranged on that first day at the flower shop. "Do you remember what you told me that day?" Richard asked gently. "That flowers do all the work on their own." Maggie felt her voice catch, overwhelmed by the emotion swelling in her chest. "You're wrong," she finally whispered, as Richard clasped her hands in his. "It's people who bring life to flowers, just as you've brought new life to my world. Maggie, I started this journey thinking I was going to change your life, but it was you who changed mine." Laura, watching the heartfelt moment with teary eyes, gave a subtle signal. The music accompanying the event gradually softened, replaced by the gentle melody of a piano. "The bet ends tomorrow," she thought to herself. Richard continued, "But I've realized I don't want anything to end. On the contrary, I want something new to begin." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd as Richard knelt down, still holding Maggie's hands. "In these past 30 days, you've taught me more about love, dignity, and authenticity than I've learned in my entire life. I'm done proving things to the world. Now, I just want to prove to you, every single day, that true love exists, and it transcends any bet or societal expectation." Maggie felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The young women from the project, who had become her family, watched on with emotional smiles. "Maggie," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me? Not for 30 days, not because of a bet, but for a lifetime." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Maggie glanced around at the smiling faces of the people who had become so dear to her. There was Mrs. Helen, who had given her a second chance. Sandra, who had embraced her with a mother's love. Laura, who had become a true friend. And all the women from the project, women who, like her, had found a fresh start in life. "When I met you at that flower shop," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I had lost faith in almost everything. You offered me an external transformation, but what I experienced was a transformation of the soul." She paused to wipe away a tear that stubbornly escaped. "Yes, Richard Monroe, I will marry you. Not because you're a billionaire, not because you turned me into a lady of society, but because together we discovered that true love doesn't require transformation. It transforms naturally." Richard stood, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a sapphire ring, not overly extravagant, but beautifully meaningful, glimmering softly. "It was my grandmother's," he explained, as he slipped it onto Maggie's finger. "She always said it should be worn by someone who understands that the real value isn't in the ring, but in the love it represents." Cheers and applause erupted backstage, quickly spilling into the main hall as word of their engagement spread. The women from the project gathered around to embrace the couple, each bringing their own story of transformation that intertwined with Maggie and Richard's. Laura, ever the practical one, was already on the phone, organizing the official press release. But for once, neither Richard nor Maggie cared about public reaction. "You know," Maggie said softly as they finally found a quiet moment together, in the end, I think we both won the bet." "How so?" Richard asked, wrapping her in his arms. "Well, you bet that you could turn someone into a lady of society, and you succeeded, but not in the way you planned. And I bet on a fresh start, a second chance at life, and I gained more than I ever dreamed." Beyond the backstage curtain, the event buzzed with excitement. The charity fashion show had been a resounding success, solidifying the Project Renaissance as a groundbreaking initiative in the fashion world. But in that intimate moment, none of it mattered. "And now?" Maggie asked, her eyes sparkling with joy. Richard leaned in, answering her question with a gentle kiss. "Let's start our story," he said, "without any bets, deadlines, or forced changes. Just the two of us, embracing who we truly are." Amid orchids and smiles, the glamour of high society intertwined with the authenticity of real stories. Maggie and Richard discovered that the greatest transformation happens when we allow true love to bloom, like a rare flower, needing no artificial touch to reveal its beauty. The Project Rebirth would continue changing lives, but its most significant achievement was already here. It lived in the love between two people brought together in the most unexpected way. And they realized that sometimes losing a bet can lead to winning the greatest prize of all, a love that's real and transformative. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.